Only band mentioned among the many. Quote, May 24th, 1865. We had a splendid day for the review. We were spoken of in high terms. You no doubt may see it in the papers. We were the only band mentioned among the many, on account of neatness of dress, brightness of instruments, and the fine music discoursed. We played the whole length of Pennsylvania Avenue. We received several fine bouquets. George T. Spaulding, tenor horn player, 1st Brigade Band. I want you to meet George and his two friends, Charles C. Stone and Edwin Oscar Kimberly. Now, as soldiers, they harmed no one, but as musicians, they seemed to play for everyone. Henry Hunt, Dan Butterfield, Oliver Otis Howard, Nathaniel P. Banks, Winfield Scott Hancock, Dan Sickles, Franz Siegel, Edwin M. Stanton, Andrew Johnson, U.S. Grant, William T. Sherman, Stephen Douglas, and Abraham Lincoln all heard their music. Their success as musicians propelled them from the town gazebo to witness a broad pageant of events that few are ever accorded. When it was all over, they simply tried to resume a normal life as though nothing had ever happened. Yet their story is largely unknown, even here in our home state of Wisconsin. They remain a bit of a mystery when compared to other Badger notables such as Alonzo Cushing, Arthur MacArthur, or Hans Christian Heg. Who were these men and what did they do? Here is the tale of 3 men, 3 bands, and their remarkable journey. Brodhead was like many of its sister communities in south central Wisconsin. It was a market crossroads where agriculture met with growing small town life. There was a newspaper, several general stores, blacksmith and wagon shops, taverns, inns, and a hotel. Bells in town marked the end of the school day and the start of Sunday worship at church. A newly arrived railroad guaranteed that manufactured goods could come in and farm produce could be carried out. On any warm summer evening, you could stand in any spot and smell home cooking mixed with the aroma of fresh paint and lumber. It was new, it was growing, and it was exciting. Something, however, was missing. With the exception of a Sunday church organ or the sound of a parlor piano drifting through an open window, it was all quite quiet. Things were about to change. From small town to big cities, brass bands were the new and popular rage. They could be organized with relatively small numbers. Big city bands could have as many as 35 to 40 musicians, while small towns could get by with as few as 6. Bands were mobile. They could march in a parade or play in a church balcony. They could ride in a bandwagon or play as they went. From weddings to funerals, from picnics to elections, there seemed to be almost nothing that a band could not play for. The new 3-valved instruments could be purchased separately, but were generally acquired in matched sets to ensure proper instrumentation and uniformity of pitch. Membership in any town band came from the working male adult population. That any music was taught in school was clearly a matter of happenstance. It was not a standardized part of the curriculum. If there was to be a band, it would be manned by the men who worked in the shops and the farms. After all, it was the menfolk who were perceived as having the physical strength to blow into a brass horn and produce a satisfactory tone. When farm chores were done and the shops and stores were closed, there would be time to read an instruction book and become self-taught masters in the art of brass music. Perhaps the greatest asset to the wind band was that it was loud, and when played in a circular gazebo, it could be heard everywhere. In early 1857, a concerned group of citizens met to do something about music in Brodhead. This included Spalding, Stone, and Kimberly. That the first Brodhead ensemble was known as the Tin Band was dictated by the cheap set of starter tin instruments they began with. Kimberly described his efforts at learning an instrument in a post-war interview for the Brodhead Independent. Quote, "As may be imagined, the beginner on any instrument of any kind is a person to be avoided because of the distressing efforts to get there. As for myself, I was required to go away back somewhere and shut myself in tightly. Peculiar sounds were continuous all over the village by day and night." Close quote. Band members sought additional help. Professor George King from nearby Monroe, Wisconsin, offered assistance. He had worked extensively with bands in his native state of Ohio and brought an indispensable knowledge and expertise in helping the band with instruction and training. Now, with his guidance, the band was able to play 3 easy pieces with a reasonable degree of skill. Over the winter of 1857-58, they acquired a real set of brass band instruments. Encouraged by their progress, they commissioned a band wagon from the Spencer Wagon Shop in Brodhead. The new rig would be pulled by a set of 4 matched gray horses donated by Hemp Stone, Charlie's brother. Hemp was an expert teamster and was happy to offer his services. Mr. Spencer saw that his quality and craftsmanship would be on display wherever the band went, and the prominent display of his name on the wagon would surely bring additional business. The 10 players were working on learning more music when they received their first invitation to play outside of Brodhead. It was spring when a request came from Beloit, Wisconsin, to play for a rally of the Wide Awake political movement and a picnic. The event would host a large crowd, and over half a dozen area bands would be present. Ready or not, the newly named Brodhead Brass Band accepted the invitation and bravely faced the crowd with its brand new brass instruments and 3-piece repertoire. They played to great success. Their musicianship proved to be surprisingly superior to the other groups. The band was given the honor of leading an immense procession through the town and out to the park, where they were hailed as the best band and given the keys to the city. Everything was free. A tradition of excellence had been born. It did not take long for word of their success to spread. Invitations quickly poured in to play to other gatherings, parades, and town picnics. The following appeared in the Brodhead Weekly Reporter, September 2nd, 1859. Quote, "The Brodhead Brass Band, having supplied themselves with a full set of instruments, would most respectfully announce to the citizens of Wisconsin that they are not going to Pikes Peak, but will be ready to furnish music for military parades, picnics, excursions, serenades, celebrations, etc. All orders addressed to the BBB will receive prompt attention. A.J. Laird, Leader." Then came an invitation from Freeport, Illinois, a prestigious and well-paying engagement. They were about to play for the first time away from their home state. It would not be the last. Freeport was witness to a titanic verbal struggle between 2 enormous personalities of the day. Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln were in town to debate the hot issue of slavery. On August 27, 1858, the second Lincoln-Douglas debate would begin. No one in the little town of Freeport ever imagined that by 2 p.m., 15,000 pairs of ears would be on hand to hear this historic political joust. Punctuating this nearly 3-hour duel were 14 men from Wisconsin playing musical instruments. Their music entertained the crowd and underscored the important points of both speakers. They had arrived the day before with an expanded ensemble eager to prove themselves worthy of high-paying events like this. The band was now up to full instrumentation, and this included tuba, baritone and tenor horns, E-flat alto horns, B-flat and E-flat cornets, as well as percussion. The men lacked band uniforms, but with the temperature soaring near the century mark, no one cared, as the bandsmen from Wisconsin seemed to please all. Now, the music, unlike the speakers, could be heard clearly by nearly everyone assembled. This was indeed amazing that such a novice group could produce a variety of tunes that included polkas, waltzes, popular selections of the day, and of course, patriotic airs. The performances were like the country itself, crude and brassy, full of life and vigor. Afterwards, many would say that these debates, particularly Freeport, would be the fuse that would lead to the explosion of Civil War. Unwittingly, the musicians from Brodhead, Wisconsin, had taken their first steps onto the stage of history, with Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas listening. Hamilton's Badger Boys, quote, "I should have wrote you sooner, but we have been waiting for our instruments, and I thought I would not write until we got them, which came last night. These being 24 instruments, a splendid set, with bell over the shoulder, brass, with the exception of one E-flat cornet, which is silver, a fine one, which the leader has given to me. We shall soon make fine music." Close quote. So wrote Edwin Oscar Kimberly to his mother on July 12, 1861. 2 years had passed since that dramatic day in Freeport. When war came that spring, they all decided to enlist together and serve for 1 year as a regiment band. As he wrote this, Oscar, along with Charlie and George, could recall with pride how they had earlier played for the senatorial candidate, now turned president. No doubt they pondered the events that took them to a makeshift training camp in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and an uncertain future. The new band was assigned to the 3rd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry. As a military band, they found their numbers doubled as the Army allowed for 26 musicians per regiment. 4 of these men, Jacob Brandt, Thomas Brown, William Douglas, and Emmett Flood, would become lifelong friends and would remain with Oscar, Charlie, and George for the rest of the war and beyond. The 19th century term for taking the train was riding the cars. The 3rd Wisconsin did just that a few days later, heading for Washington. Word was that the Army would soon move against the rebels, and it seemed the boys in the 3rd would not miss out on the offensive that would surely end the war. Upon their arrival, they were astonished to find that they were to be diverted to Camp Pinckney, Maryland, for further training and garrison duty, and not join General McDowell's forces moving on Richmond. As well as musical camp duties, the band was given ambulance training. When battle was over, they were to lay aside their instruments and lend a hand with retrieving the wounded and dead from the field. They were instructed on how to remove the wooden stretcher from an ambulance, get to the nearest injured soldier, and bring him back. Speed of loading was considered essential. A good ambulance team needed to get as many soldiers to the field hospital as quickly as possible. I need to add, no first aid training accompanied this. Like most volunteers on both sides, these young lads were full of themselves. that any one of ours could lick 10 of theirs. Badger bravura completely spread through the camps of the 3rd Wisconsin with boundless pride in their country, state, regiment, and the commanding officer, Colonel Charles Hamilton. Hamilton was a rising star in the Badger State political firmament. Ever popular with his men and cheered wherever he went, the man was loved and respected as few officers were, and Edwin Oscar Kimberly was determined to do something about that. He composed a song he entitled Hamilton's Badger Boys. It was a tune filled with politics, sentiment, and fervor of the times. It sort of went like this. We're Hamilton's Badger Boys, and hither we've come from woody Wisconsin, our dearly loved home, to fight for the Union, to conquer or die, and to raise in the full land our wild battle cry. There were references to Governor Alexander Randall's speech to the regiment at Camp Hamilton in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. Our governor equipped us and told us to go and flail out the Union's most treacherous foe, to pound him right hard on God's threshing floor, and not to return till rebellion was o'er. Kimberly proudly sang his work for the colonel. Oscar possessed an excellent singing voice. It was a musical skill he would come to use repeatedly. His composition was performed in their Maryland camp on July 22nd, 1861, the day after Bull Run. The music also makes mention of their stern ranks of gray. The first 5 Wisconsin regiments were uniformed in militia gray at war's start. The music, however, was not published until 1899. Colonel Charles Hamilton and their new commander, Nathaniel P. Banks, were added to the list of the famous who heard the music from this Wisconsin band. The men of the 3rd were to be part of Banks' gathering army that would move against the Shenandoah Valley, the breadbasket of the South. Now, while the nature of war began to change, conflicts within the band began to emerge. Interpretation over the loose regulations for bands would lead to arguments over authority. By September 1861, Kimberly had one such quarrel with the leader of the band. He deemed him to be incompetent and not capable of executing his duties. In a letter to his parents, Oscar called him a fool of a Dutchman. Eventually, the officers of the 3rd replaced him with Kimberly. Oscar was proud of his appointment. As new leader, he could begin to think about improvements to the band. What he didn't anticipate were the unimaginable challenges that awaited his leadership. Oscar's war was proving to be of a very different nature than what he had bargained for. His fight was not with the Confederate Army, but rather a never-ending skirmish against constantly breaking instruments and dwindling players. Disease, not mini-balls, thinned the ranks of the musicians. On some days, entire sections of the band reported sick, no doubt making what must have been appalling omissions in the music. Little imagination is required to think of Yankee Doodle or Hail Columbia without the melody. On the other hand, a bandsman could be healthy, report for duty, and still not make music with the total breakdown of his instrument. The horns issued by the state proved to be of exceedingly poor quality. Even the old tin horns back in Brodhead were better than these brass embarrassments. The end result was the same: gaping holes in the music. When it seemed things couldn't possibly get worse, of course they did. In early spring 1862, Banks began his long-awaited move against the valley. Banks was completely outclassed by his gray adversary, Stonewall Jackson. Almost from the start, he was clueless as to the real danger that he and his army were really in. Orderly battlefield retirement quickly became a panic. Kimberly wrote, quote, "Ours was the first regiment to cross the Potomac River at Harper's Ferry. We tramped for days and weeks on the borders of the Shenandoah, whose waters are nonetheless beautiful, being ensconced amid a valley so profoundly rich. As a regiment and as a band, I need not say that our reverses were many. At Edinburgh, Virginia, we presented our instruments to the Rebs and proceeded precipitously on our way to Maryland. Fearful times those when fiendish women fired on us from housetop and ambush. We were pressed on either flank and rear by an overwhelming force. Some of us reached the Potomac that night, and by the aid of horses and mules pulled for the other shore, trusting to the endurance of the animals to accomplish the desired result. Some of us crossed ad libitum." Quote, close quote. Once safe in Union territory, Oscar struggled mightily to restore the band, but it was no use. Regimental funds for the band had completely dried up, and with it any hope for replacement instruments. The officers of the 3rd decided to have no further efforts at music and had the men simply wait for their enlistments to expire. On July 22nd, 1862, exactly 1 year to the date after the premiere of Hamilton's Badger Boys, most of the members of the 3rd Wisconsin Infantry Band were discharged. Now, all this time, Charlie Stone never let on that he had never signed papers of enlistment. He simply went along with all the other bandsmen. The officers of the regiment never questioned his presence. Charlie was always there with his E-flat bass horn doing his duty. He just wanted to be with his friends. With their enlistment up, the boys returned home. In 1863, Oscar received chilling news that his brother William had been killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Oscar wrote in a 1911 Brodhead Independent article, quote, "Just before midnight, May 3rd, 1863, Father and myself were startled by a terrible cry of distress from my mother. 'Oh my God, Willie is killed!' But I said, 'Mother, are you dreaming?' 'Oh no,' she insisted. 'I am not dreaming. It is real. For I can now see my dear boy there wounded unto death, and we shall soon hear.'" Brodhead Independent, September 27th, 1911. Off to war again. Quote, "The Brodhead Band are going to war. For a long time, efforts have been made to induce the band to enlist and go to war as a brigade band. Since their return from the Army up to last week, the boys couldn't see it, and probably would have been as blind Andrew himself, but for the little 200,000 call. Their intention is now to enlist from the town of Decatur, if they can get $300 of bounty. If not, they will go elsewhere, draw a big bounty, and go in as a brigade band. Brodhead will be quite lonely without them socially, while it will take from us some of our best businessmen and mechanics." Close quote. Brodhead Independent, February 12, 1864. Quote, "Bounty money. This township voted today to raise $1,600 by tax, in addition to $2,000 heretofore voted, to pay for volunteers. We understand the band are to receive the bounty, and off for the wars." Brodhead Independent, April 29th, 1864. Quote, Out of the ashes, phoenix-like, has arisen a band of far more than shadowy existence, now numbering 19 noble young men, including some from abroad, all of whom have enlisted for the war and constitute the 1st Brigade Band, assigned to the 3rd Division, 15th Army Corps, now at Huntsville, Alabama, commanded by Logan. The band is supplied, at its own expense, with a magnificent set of silver instruments from the celebrated manufactory of D.C. Hall at Boston, costing an aggregate of $870.30, and has been for several weeks perfecting by practice. It is now ordered off and will take its leave for Alabama next Tuesday morning. We reluctantly part company with the boys, but will submit with a better grace because we know that they are noble patriots who will be eager to play the Rogue's March for Jeff and his fiendish associates in crime. They will give the trump no uncertain sound when required to strike the knell of the Confederacy, nor play with muffled drum or suppressed note at its funeral chant. Brodhead Independent, April 29, 1864. Once again, the band rode the cars, headed for war. This time it would be different. The light-hearted frivolity of '61 was replaced with a quiet determination simply to do their part. 3 vital changes would separate this term of service from the last. First was to purchase a set of their own instruments and not rely on government issue. The best available were from D.C. Hall of Boston, and a full set of horns and percussion were secured. They were a matched set of over-the-shoulder horns made of German silver. Now, German silver was perceived as superior to ordinary brass. It produced a brighter sound that was more desired for outdoor work. Matched silver instruments also added luster to their appearance. At the time, there was no universal standard for pitch or tuning. Each manufacturer was free to build their instruments to whatever pitch center they desired. Matched sets guaranteed that they were built from the same material by the same manufacturer to similar specifications. Brass instruments could be interchanged between ensembles, but only with some difficulty. Second would be the uniforms. These were tailored from the firm of Smith & Bostwick of Janesville. The trousers were dark blue with a light blue pinstripe. Matching vest and bright brass eagle buttons with a high collar were added. The frock coat was chosen for the tunic. Since they were bandsmen and not regular line soldiers, they were free to choose the officer style rather than the usual enlisted man's 4-button coat. A black slouch hat with a blue infantry cord complemented the uniform, giving them a very distinctive and gentlemanly appearance. And the third would be the music, and perhaps the most important part. The brown leather-bound part books contained some 62 selections that included patriotic music, dance music, funeral dirges, serenades, popular songs, classical music selections from grand opera. It was up to each bandsman to hand copy his music into his music book. Printed music at the time was simply not widely available. The command structure of military music was unlike any other. Officers did not command military bands. The structure for volunteer bands usually went like this. First, the leader, in this case, Edwin Oscar Kimberly, E-flat cornet. His job was similar to that of a business manager. He would work with the officers of the regiment in setting the duties for the musicians. Band leaders would establish the protocols for ceremonies, duties, and other desired determinations as to when and where they would play. The leader looked out after the welfare of the men. Food, clothing, supplies, and any other considerations for the band fell to the work of the leader. Now, while he was not an officer, the leader carried the pay grade of second lieutenant. 2. The director, J.M. Faust, E-flat cornet. His task was to look after the music, to see that the band was rehearsed and fit for playing. This was something that a leader and a director did together. In a field band, the director did not have the luxury of wielding a baton. Instead, he was playing as a playing director who would simply count off the beat and essentially start the music with a 1, 2, ready, go style. It's the way that leading bands remain to this day, especially with circus bands. 3. Secretary. In this case, George Spaulding, tenor horn player. He would keep the paperwork for the band. The secretary would transmit all daily files and reports on the band to headquarters. He would keep an ongoing roster of those who were present for duty, on sick call, on leave, or on detached duty. 4. Treasurer. Norman Hall, drum. His job was to keep track of all band pay, funds for equipment, and supplies, and make appropriate requisitions to headquarters. It was his job to seek out extra funds for additional music or replacement instruments. It required a close working relationship with the leader and the director. Drum major, S.S. Jackson. Not all bands had one. He was the only one to have shoulder boards on his uniform. Embroidered on them were the letters D.M. The drum major carried a bulb-headed mace, somewhere around 4 foot in length. It was adorned with a long cord, a long tasseled cord that wound the length of the wooden shaft. Drum majors were not considered bandsmen, as they did not play an instrument. They were assigned to duty with a band, but not part of the band. Rather, it was their job to lead them on the march during formal ceremonies. Many drum majors wore fancy animal pelt shako or bearskins. We've got an image up here on the table. There's a drum major with I think he's got a mace. I had only a brief shot at it. And he's got a wonderful shako on. And some drum majors sported this. Instead, Jackson wore a simple slouched hat, but added a sash to his uniform. On the way south, the band made a brief stop in Nashville, and this stop would foreshadow their success. Quote, under the direction of its skilled leader, Mr. E.O. Kimberly, it gave several popular airs with marked excellence and winning applause. The Nashville Press, May 12, 1864. Immediately upon their arrival in Huntsville, Alabama, they began to make music. Quote, a band of 20 men arrived from Brodhead, Wisconsin last evening, assigned to the 1st Brigade, 3rd Division, 15th Army Corps. Early in the evening, they opened in front of 12th Battery headquarters. They formed in a circle, and in the gentle twilight played numerous airs, patriotic and melancholy. The sweetest of all, Home Sweet Home. The green was covered with soldiers lying at full length, dreamily enjoying the sweet music, forgetful of all the past, in blissful forgetfulness of all things real. The instruments were of German silver, making a very good appearance. May they serve us such a treat often. Jenkin Lloyd Jones, Private, 6th Wisconsin Battery. Kimberly sent letters to both his mother and the hometown paper. In a letter to the Brodhead Independent dated May 19th, he described life in Huntsville. Our duty consists of playing 3 or 4 pieces at 8 a.m. for guard mounting, devoting about 2 hours to practice in the forenoon, and the same in the afternoon. And by the way, we are improving finely. After supper, every evening we would play a few pieces at the Courthouse Park. This is a delightful place, after which there is usually some place in view to serenade. If not, well, we find other amusement. Close quote. Towards the end of the month, the band found itself boarding a gunboat on a reconnaissance of the Tennessee River. The warship was about to round the bend to begin shelling a small rebel fort when Kimberly asked to have the band led ashore. No one is really quite sure who opened up on the fort first, the gunboat with its cannon or the band blasting Yankee Doodle with its horns. In any case, the Graybacks gave up the fort, with the band continuing to taunt them with national airs as they retreated. The band's presence was beginning to be felt. The boys spent 4th of July in Kingston, Georgia. Once again, their music had a profound effect on all that gathered. Quote, "The band has been playing America and is now giving Home Sweet Home in touching strains that go to hearts of all." Jenkins Lloyd Jones, 6th Wisconsin Battery. 1864 was proving to be a vast improvement over 1861. Good equipment, music, and leadership had indeed given the boys a true sense of accomplishment not felt 2 years earlier. There was, however, one nemesis that they could not shake: disease. In a letter to his mother, dated August 17th, Oscar expressed his concern over the health of the bandsmen. "I am afraid we shall lose Pomeroy and probably Brown. Stone is worse, and I think he will be furloughed. Though maybe he isn't as sick as the others." Close quote. By August 1864, the stricken bandsmen were sent home on leave to recover. Kimberly wrote on August 26th, quote, "The furloughs came in this morning, and it seemed to be a blessing to all, Charlie Stone especially." Close quote. Stone and his tuba would be sorely missed. For a time, Oscar set aside his cornet to play the badly needed big horn. A replacement soon arrived from Evansville, Wisconsin. Kimberly wrote on September 21st, 1864, quote, "Tell Stone to be sure and fetch me a set and a half of large Badger buttons and a set of small Badger buttons. We played a military ball at division headquarters last night, and we had a fine time." Though he was a good musician and friend, Charlie could be slow to the point of exasperation. On November 2nd, Oscar wrote, "When is Charlie coming back? Tell him to send those buttons." Close quote. Charlie sent the buttons, recovered, and returned to resume his tuba playing. A few days later, the band endured a hard march down the Etowah River in Georgia. By August 30th, only 8 players could be mustered for duty. In spite of this, the 1st Brigade Band maintained a standard of excellence. Generals began to compete for their services. General Oliver Otis Howard wanted the band to continue to lead his Sunday worship services. Quote, "We continue to improve in playing. We are looked upon as a band of gentlemen and good musicians by the entire division. General Smith is trying to get us at his headquarters, and he thinks the world of us. I think if the Brodhead people could hear us play, or the Janesville people, they would open their eyes." Edwin Oscar Kimberly to his mother in an undated letter. It was becoming clear that this was something more than a mere field band. If war can be described as a contest of arms, then the 1st Brigade Band became embroiled in a contest of instruments. From Cartersville, Georgia, 1864, Oscar wrote the following on September 15th. Quote, "A circumstance took place in town last night, certainly worthy of note. We went down about sundown, and about 8 o'clock began to play at Smith's headquarters. General Smith then requested us to serenade a Michigan colonel. We proceeded to the place, and the general with us. After playing 3 or 4 pieces, we left and went over to Dr. Winston's quarters of the 1st Wisconsin Cavalry, acting division surgeon. The doctor is from Evansville, Wisconsin, and some of our boys know him well. After playing a piece there, another band struck up about 50 rods from us, which proved to be a band belonging to the regiment we had just left, the 15th Michigan Infantry. They were a fair band. They would play a piece, and then we would. After playing 3 or 4 pieces, we then played a new piece we had just learned, a fine thing. After finishing it, they struck up with the same thing, which of course, this was considered an insult. Our boys swore then that we would run them out, determined to play the last piece. And the other band also made the same determination, that they would play the last piece and run the damned badgers out. Of course, on such occasion, both bands had been drinking pretty freely and were excited and maddened to no low pitch. We kept on as soon as they finished playing a piece, and we were ready to start in playing every piece they did if we had it. They sent a man over to see what we had to play, and we had done the same. Their colonel was with them and swore he would hang the first man that gave out. The whole affair was like a hard contested battle. At 1 o'clock, we were still going at it. Quick as they would stop, we would start right in. We were determined to play until 8 o'clock in the morning if necessary. The doctor said he would go out and get us some breakfast. Liquors were set out on the table for the boys to drink just when they had a mind to. Both bands kept on until about 3 o'clock. It was their turn to play. They failed to come out. We waited patiently. Our spy came back and informed us that they had given up. We played Yankee Doodle at the double quick. Our boys shouted victory. We had whipped them and forced a retreat. Close quote. By this time, another more deadly battle had been fought and won. Sherman had captured Atlanta and was making preparations for his next move. Since a period of inactivity appeared to be at hand, Kimberly applied for and received a furlough for the entire band. Oscar and his boys were home in time to enjoy Christmas with family and friends. On January 4th, 1865, the boys rode the cars again. This time, they were headed east to New York City, where they would take a steamer south to rejoin Sherman. Now, before departing, they took time to serenade a host of famous officers that were staying on leave at various hotels. Winfield Scott Hancock, Dan Butterfield, Dan Sickles, Franz Siegel were among the notables to hear the mellow sounds of the 1st Brigade Band. The New York Herald saw fit to devote several paragraphs describing the event. On January 22, 1865, the men marched off the gangplank of a coastal steamer at Savannah, Georgia, to rejoin their old command. They found themselves playing for Sherman himself. Yesterday, quote, "Yesterday, General Sherman and Logan stopped at these headquarters, and we played and sung for them, for which they thanked us and sent us 2 gallons of ale," close quote. If the boys were going to drink it, they better do it pretty quickly. Sherman was on the move, taking his army north through the Carolinas, up to Richmond to link with Grant and together end the war. There had been a long feeling in the Union Army that South Carolina was responsible for the war, inasmuch as it was the first to secede and to fire on the Union. It had been a hard war for these boys, and we were in no mood to be charitable. South Carolina would pay for its treason. Southerners had long thought even if the Yankees did get this far south, they'd be swallowed up whole by the wilderness and impenetrable swamps. Little did they reckon with the Bluecoats' seasoned ability to improvise and build bridges on the move. Instead of taking a year, it took Sherman only a month to march clean through the state. It proved to be one of the roughest marches the band had yet encountered. They struggled in waist-deep swamps with rebel snipers ever lurking about in the moss and cypress trees. Playing in New York, that was a distant dream when on February 27th, Columbia, the capital of South Carolina, fell to federal forces. The city was set afire, probably by the retreating Confederates. As it burned, the 1st Brigade Band was one of 12 bands gathered to play at what one player described as full blast. They all struck up together the Anvil Chorus from Verdi's opera Old Trovatore. You know, bum, bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. That's the Anvil Chorus. One distraught inhabitant remarked how the bands then started to play Yankee Doodle over and over just to spite the population. The Army continued its march out of the Palmetto State and into North Carolina. By early April, they had a bit of a rest in the vicinity of Goldsboro. In a letter of April 7, 1865, Kimberly described what must have been the proudest moment in his life. Quote, "Last night, according to previous notice, we repaired to Sherman's headquarters for a serenade. A new song composed by prisoners, Lieutenant H.S.M. Bayers of Iowa, who wrote the song while a prisoner of war in Charleston, South Carolina, is in my possession. Entitled, 'When Sherman Marched Down to the Sea.' After some rehearsing, I was the first one to sing it before our old hero, Billy T. Sherman, and his entire staff, after which I sang another and received a very high compliment from Sherman. After playing several pieces, the crack band of the Army made its appearance, namely the 33rd Massachusetts, and played several pieces. After all this, we played another piece and returned to camp. We felt assured that we had done honor to ourselves at least. After getting in camp, our brigadier, Clark, came with a compliment from Sherman to our band, stating that we were the model band for his entire army. This, said by a general of such wide world renown, is certainly a great thing, a great feather in our caps. During the campaign, we had done considerable playing and were spoken of in very highly as good players and a band of gentlemen. We strive to live up to and merit a continuance of that good name." Close quote. April saw the end of the war. It was decided to hold a victory parade in Washington with as many soldiers as possible. The Grand Review would be held as a 2-day affair, starting with Grant and Meade's Army of the Potomac, followed the next day by Sherman's Army of the Tennessee. George T. Spaulding, horn player with the 1st Brigade Band, wrote to his wife in Brodhead, quote, "May 24th, 1865. We had a splendid day for the review and were on the move at daylight and moved for Capitol Hill at 9 o'clock and passed the reviewing stand at 10 o'clock, where were the big heads of the nation. Everything passed off finely. After we had played through the city and fell out and went back to Pennsylvania Avenue and saw the balance of the Army pass. We were spoken of in high terms by the reporter of the review. You no doubt may see it in the papers. We were the only band mentioned among the many, perhaps on account of neatness of dress, brightness of instruments, and the fine music discoursed. It said the band of the 15th Corps attracted much attention. So much for us. We played the whole length of Pennsylvania Avenue. We received several fine bouquets, close quote. The band spent a short time in Kentucky, filling out its term of enlistment. Here it was known on paper as the Band of the 2nd Brigade, 4th Division. The name never took hold. It was a paper holder. They soon returned to Brodhead in triumph, with respect. But history was not quite finished with Mr. Kimberly and his band. The citizens of Galena, Illinois, had prepared a homecoming for its favorite son, Ulysses S. Grant. No detail was overlooked, including the music that would mark the festive occasion. After talking with as many returning Army veterans, they felt that the best band possible would be the 15th Corps Band, the 1st Brigade Band. Would they come? Oscar replied with a resounding yes. The only problem was a bandwagon. The boys had sold off their old bandwagon, and a new one could not be built in time. The solution came from the nearby town of Sholesburg, Wisconsin. They were very happy and loaned their bandwagon to Brodhead. The local newspaper in Galena ran a special edition recounting the momentous event, taking great pains to point out the wonderful brass music provided by the 15th Corps Band from Sholesburg. The name painted on the side of the wagon said Sholesburg. To what the guest of honor thought, to what Grant thought, we can only speculate because Grant never made mention of it. History is left to draw the only comment that General Grant ever made about music. It was sometime before the war when Grant said that he knew only 2 tunes. One was Yankee Doodle and the other wasn't. Don't laugh, the man was tone deaf. This to him was just noise. Post-war life took its toll on the band, scattering the original members all over the country. New players filled the vacant ranks, and for many years the people of Brodhead took pride and enjoyment from their music makers. For a while, it was the Brodhead Silver Cornet Band, complete with modern bell-front instruments and policeman-style uniforms that gave, uniforms that gave music to the town. The old wartime horns were used to train other musicians. From time to time, the music from the old band books would be played at reunions. In 1933, the Chicago Tribune sponsored a performance of the music of the 1st Brigade Band at the Chicago World's Fair. They did it using the original part books and a handful of surviving instruments. So ends their tale. George, Oscar, and Charlie, they saw it all. They were there when the fuse was lit in Freeport. They witnessed the debacles that characterized the early Eastern War, and they saw the final victory. When it was over, they returned to Illinois once more to pay homage to the architect of the federal victory. The story of these 3 musicians and 3 bands now seems like some distant, storied fable. Postscript. Edwin Oscar Kimberly, born in Pinchback near Lancashire, England, April 21st, 1840. His family immigrated to the United States in 1849. In 1857, he arrived in Brodhead. After the war, he returned to Brodhead and married Ada Pratt. Became a printer and owner of the Brodhead Independent. Died December 24th, 1919. George T. Spaulding, born in Proctorsville, Vermont, September 29, 1833. Married Fredelia Shedd in 1860. Successful Brodhead businessman, died November 28, 1904. Charles Charlie Clinton Stone, born August 30th, 1831, in St. Lawrence County, New York. He was one of the original planners of Brodhead and helped in laying out the original town. After the war, he was a respected auctioneer and participated in local veterans programs, including riding his white horse at the annual Decoration Day parades. Charlie Stone died in 1918. The boys lie at peace, and their music is forever stilled. But that is until 1964. But I better stop there. That, as they say, is another story. Thank you.